everybody, to the SIU Today podcast. I'm John Wickman, and as always, I'm with my co-host, Jesse Lopez. Jesse, how's it in Houston right now? It's cool and
It's
breezy.
it's still hot. It's still very hot, over 100 degrees, but hopefully it'll start getting cooler and we'll get some rain.
It sounds great. It's actually 72 degrees in Chicago right now, so it's perfect outside. There's no humidity. It's really nice, so don't be too jealous.
Right?
Today, we're going to be talking about combating insurance fraud in a globalized world. And today I've got Celeste. Celeste, welcome back to the podcast. This is exciting. You've got two in a row here, Matthew and Dennis. So let's start with Matthew. Matthew, you are the director of the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud. Is that the proper term?
Well, I guess if we want to be official, the executive director, but it's the job where the buck stops. So that's where I sit right now, John.
So you're going to be retiring soon and you're going to be moving on. However, you're here with us right now to kind of give us all of your knowledge and insight through all the years. So I guess give a little bit of background about yourself. And so those who do not know you that are watching this, which I find that hard to believe, at least get to know you a little bit.
Well, thank you. And John and Jesse, it's great to be here. And there's no organization that the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud has more pleasure in partnering with than IASIU, and the great job that all of you do in helping this wonderful profession that we're in. And John, it's somewhat tongue in cheek, but part of the reason I'm retiring at the end of the year is I am the old guy on the podcast. So my background literally goes back to 1985 when I handled my first insurance fraud case. It was a guy who lit his boat on fire on the Halifax River in Daytona Beach, Florida. And I was hooked from that day forward. So insurance fraud investigation, doing it from the legal perspective as a lawyer. I spent 35 years building and running a law firm that handled a lot of insurance fraud, worked with major insurance carriers across the United States, doing those types of cases in bad faith. I had the privilege then of becoming the general counsel on a volunteer basis for the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud, never realizing that when I hung up my career from the courtroom, it would become the wonderful career it has. So since late 2017, I have been here at the Coalition in Washington, D.C., serving in a number of capacities, and just think that this anti-fraud fight is literally so important, and the great partnerships that we've been able to build have been the highlight of my now almost 40 years in this profession.
Well, we appreciate you coming on the show today. And Dennis, you kind of spearheaded this whole topic. So can you explain your background and a little bit about yourself as well?
Yeah, first of all, I think I'm at an unfair disadvantage because Matthew went first and now I have to talk about my background, which is much less exciting than his. But yeah, thanks. First, thanks for inviting me to do the podcast. You know, it's a really important topic of I've been doing this for about 30 years. Started out my career in law enforcement and was investigating auto accidents, and, you know, really got to understand how the accidents that were focused with the insurance industry, I guess, for lack of a better term. And then, so I went to go work for Liberty Mutual Insurance Company, worked there for about 14 and a half years. And while I was working there, back in the 90s, I realized that data was becoming much more popular, and helped the investigators that worked for me and with me become more efficient. So after I left Liberty Mutual, I went to LexisNexis, and I worked for them for about 5 years, traveling around the United States and pontificating the benefits of using data to help the investigators become more efficient. So then I had the industry experience, the data experience, and I wanted to get into the analytics. So I went to go work for a company called SAS in the security intelligence practice. And with SAS, I had the opportunity to travel around the globe and, you know, meet a number of really, really interesting people, learning best practices, challenges, trends, you know, things that are happening, and how fraud fighters are struggling to keep up with the fraud that's going on. So then I had the industry experience, the data, the analytics. So I wanted to go into consultant, and now here I am as a director in our risk and compliance analytics group for a company called Protivity, where we help organizations with fraud risk assessments and, you know, talking about fraud and transnational organized crime around the globe.
Well, thanks for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Mm.
And now we have the president of IASIU, Celeste. Welcome back.
Thank
for
you.
those who missed the first episode, maybe give a brief background on yourself.
So I am IASU's president. I've been in that role for 3 years. And in addition to my role as president of the organization, I'm also Been in the insurance industry and in SIU for over 25 years, managing regional and national SIU operations. So I've been very involved. I've been connected to the coalition for more than a decade, and have been working closely with both Matthew and Dennis, which is one of the reasons we're having this podcast today, on some of the global issues we'll be speaking of. And so this is, an opportunity for IASU to share some of the things that we're involved in and share the knowledge with our members when we look at some of the exposures that we all face globally.
Well, welcome everybody. So to jump into this, I think the best way to start talking about it is Matthew, in 2021 at the Global Fraud Summit, the coalition released a study. Can you kind of explain what that study was and what was in it?
I'd be glad to, John. And it's very interesting because we were talking about the globalization of insurance fraud before this little thing known as COVID-19 and a pandemic struck the world. But to roll the clock back, in March of 2020, when the US started shutting down for COVID-19, people may remember, we all know that the virus started in Asia, but the big focus in late February and early March in the US was on Italy and what was going on in Italy and Europe with the pandemic. And the coalition was in touch at that time with Interpol, with Europol, with some of our partners in Europe. And they were already seeing fraud schemes and fraud scams, everything from life insurance to towing fraud and vehicle disinfection issues, all of those types of things. And as the pandemic came to the United States, so too did those frauds. And that culminated actually on March 31st of 2020, when the coalition reached out to IASIU and NICB, and we said we need to do a webinar on COVID-19 fraud and the global implications of this. Well, we didn't know at the time, we ended up with more than 3,000 people on that webinar. It was the largest anti-fraud gathering, now granted virtual, but the largest anti-fraud gathering ever in world history, when 3,000 fraud fighters from around the globe looked at this issue of insurance fraud in COVID-19. And I'd like to think we got ahead of the curve. So why is that important? Well, that was in March of 2020, and that was the genesis of an idea that the coalition looked around and we realized there had never been a research study done to measure and analyze the impact and the preparedness for global insurance fraud. So not being shy, we took that project on through our research committee, and we developed the world's first study on the globalization of insurance fraud. And we released that study in 2021. Took the better part of a year to build it, run it, analyze all of the data, and look at the significance of it. And we ended up making the presentation of that global study the keynote address at the 2021 Global Insurance Fraud Summit. And that was a virtual event, still due to the pandemic. But we had, and Dennis can probably remember, I think we had well over 50 countries that participated in that particular virtual summit, where we rolled out this globalization study. So from that study, we really learned 4 key points as relates to insurance carriers here in the United States. Number one, which is kind of the sad part of the study, is overwhelmingly, US insurers told us that they felt their company either had a very low priority or no priority given to global fraud. It was shocking. They all said, we're not giving it any priority in our organization here in the US. But the next key point that we learned was that virtually, no study is ever going to be 100%, but in the high 80 percentiles, every US insurer said, this is a tidal wave of fraud that's coming that we need to address. So A, we're not prepared for it. B, we know it's coming and it's something that's going to overwhelm us if we're not prepared. So those were the first 2 points that we learned. The third point is we delved into it a little bit more. We said, why aren't you prepared? And the response back was lack of resources. And the lack of resources was both data and human. And overarching both of those was monetary. We don't have the data, we don't have the staff to address global insurance fraud because we don't have the financial support to do it. And that was an overwhelming response that we got back. Now, I think probably in today's webinar, we're going to talk a little bit more about the technology and the great data resources that are available out there and how those can be pivoted to look more, on a global scene. But that's what we were told. So that was a third significant finding. The fourth significant finding, which was a little bit interesting, but I think is probably insightful, is that U.S. insurers told us, while we're concerned about the transnational organized crime, while we're concerned about organized rings that may emanate out of Russia or somewhere else committing insurance fraud, what they thought was the single biggest threat was an individual on another continent with a laptop and a good internet connection. And how do you find that person and how do you stop that fraud? So it wasn't they aren't concerned on the transnational and the organized, but they saw the biggest threat being the ability for people to commit insurance fraud now, just as easily against a U.S. insurance company. If you live literally across the street from their corporate headquarters, or if you are half a globe away and have an internet connection, you can commit fraud just as easily. So those were kind of the four highlights that we learned from the globalization of insurance fraud study. And I will put out a little promotion that anybody that wants to look at that study, because it's still very timely, then you're a coalition member, go to insurancefraud.org, about fraud, under research, and you can read the whole study.
Thank you, Matthew. So fraud seems to be a growing concern for the insurance industry. Dennis, can you comment on why the increase of fraud?
Yeah, sure. And I think, what Matthew just talked about with the globalization of insurance fraud, I think that's probably one of the biggest reasons. We're seeing fraudsters that are setting up shop, just like that study predicted. They're setting up shop in these different regions that, don't have insurance fraud laws or aren't really strict with their internet policies and protocols. And they're looking for ways to scheme and scam the insurance industries. I think you couple that with the geopolitical unrest that we're seeing around the globe, whether it's with the Ukraine and Russia or China and Thailand or, any of these conflicts that are popping up everywhere. It's causing, I guess, departments of justices from around the world and, organizations to take their eye off of what are we going to do for white collar crime and focus on this unrest that's happening. And it's also creating an environment for fraudsters to hide behind that to create more things, more opportunities. And then if you think about the economic dip that's going on around the globe, and we have plenty of stats that show when the economy goes down, fraud goes up. People want to maintain their standard of living. They're ethically challenged, or they are criminally minded people that are going to take advantage of these situations, and they'll do whatever it takes to keep up their standard of living, whether it's committing insurance fraud or not. And then you match that up with the lack of focus that carriers are having because of a number of different things that are going on in the industry, whether it's a catastrophe or whatever the case may be, or straight through processing or customer friction type activity that's going on. They're taking their eye off of the fraudsters and they're taking advantage of that and moving forward with it. So I think those primary things, those are the primary reasons that I think that it's rising at a rate that we've never seen, exponentially faster than I've ever seen in my 30 years over the last couple of years. I don't know, Celeste, what do you think? You probably have a couple of other ones that you can add to this.
Yeah, as I think about it, technology is changing so rapidly. And the fraudsters are using it to their advantage. They're spending time. So for the insurance investigators and the carriers out there, we've got so many things that are pulling our attention that these fraudsters are spending most of their time thinking, how can they take advantage of the carriers, the policyholders, and take money that doesn't belong to them? And they're really, really good. And so as I look at what we're doing as an industry, it's really important for us to have the resources allocated toward identifying and investigating insurance fraud. And also not just the people, but it's such an important part of that, the investigators that understand, know, are trained to be able to find this type of fraud, but it's also making sure we have the technology to help us identify the fraud. Because if we're not evolving in our technology and utilizing technology to find the fraud, we'll be even farther behind. So it's so critical that carriers recognize that by not dedicating their resources and resources to identify and fight fraud, it's just going to grow. I mean, there are no borders anymore. As you talk about, globalization. So ISIU is an international organization because there are no borders, because we see that what happens in one country is happening in another at the same time. We've got people, so Matthew talks about that study where the biggest concern is one person sitting somewhere in this globe with a laptop. That is so real, happening every day. People are committing fraud where a local, even a regional carrier, believes that everybody is in one area, but they've got someone across the globe that is committing insurance fraud, and they may not even know it, not unless they have the technology and the resources to identify it and resist it. And it's so important. And if you look at another piece that's happening, so you think about a lot of different crimes over the decades, and you've probably heard, and we talk about like auto theft is a good example. So typically when a criminal steals a vehicle, that's not the last part of the crime. That could oftentimes be the beginning. So when you look at what's happening with fraud globally and the technology, how technology is utilized, think about cybercrime. So we have individuals that are committing all types of crime, utilizing the web. And one of those things that they're doing, one of the pieces that as they look at opportunity is insurance fraud. So there's a connection between those that are involved in cybercrime and fraud, insurance fraud that we see daily. And I know, and Matthew could probably speak to a little bit more than I can, but there has just recently been a case involving ransomware where the government was able to shut it down. And so now you think about those criminals that are involved in that crime. Where are they going now? They're going to look for opportunities. They're going to look where the money is. And there's opportunity in insurance, unfortunately. Matthew, I don't know if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Well, Celeste, I think you and Dennis are spot on correct on this. And where it all comes together is we all know that insurance fraud and insurance crimes are always going to be motivated by money. And look at the amount of fraud going back to the pandemic. The UN released a report in May of 2020 that showed a 600% spike in malicious malware and phishing that was being done during the pandemic to profit off of the pandemic. The Federal Trade Commission in the United States in 1 year alone showed 148% increase in identity thefts in our country. And that was low compared to other nations. So all of this is driven by the easy way during that time period to commit multiple frauds, whether it was unemployment compensation, whether it was stealing people's identities, making false claims. But now, as things start ratcheting down a bit, and those funds aren't available as easily, these criminals, both domestically and globally, are going to look at who's got the money. And it's going to be insurance fraud because they know it's an easy target. They know that many carriers, like our study showed, are not prepared for global fraud. And so that's what you're referring to. Let's take just one small example. But to their credit, the US federal government, in cooperation with global authorities from the UK, Netherlands, France, Germany, and Latvia, just this week shut down a major ransomware group called Qbot. And that group alone, at a minimum, have been responsible for $58 million of ransomware attacks in the last year alone. And basically, they're fairly confident they shut it down. But even the authorities that worked on this globally said it's kind of like whack-a-mole. We know they're going to pop up somewhere else. They're not just going to go away because they shut them down using technology, not leading them out for a perp walk in handcuffs. So they're still out there and they're still multiplying. So they're going to divert now and say, well, ransomware is too hot for us to go after. So where do we turn next for easy money? And that's where you're going to see the insurance fraud. And at the same time, these international groups that are operating, they're not looking at cutting back. They're not looking at making budget reductions. They're looking at how can we increase what we're doing? How can we get more people involved in the scams? How can we get more adept at using the technology to commit insurance fraud? So I think literally every American insurer right now has a target on their back, with the center being the globe, that the global operations are where this is going to come from. And it's everything from submitting false claims to one of the big things we're seeing, and I was talking with regulators earlier this week, are payment diversions. And this is coming, in workers' comp with state-funded workers' comp carriers that are seeing people stealing identities, learning bank account information, and then stealing those payments that should have been made to someone on a legitimate claim, but it's diverted to a country somewhere around the globe. And good luck investigating that and trying to get that money back. But that's where we're really headed as we look at some of the things that you, Celeste, and Dennis were talking about.
And I want to add to that, Matthew, because as you think about the identity theft part of that, so it's happening in workers' comp, happening in banking. Every time I turn on the TV, I see an ad for, some type of product that says they'll help you deal with the ramifications of identity theft. So it's across the nation and it's impacting everybody, whether it be the banking, the credit cards, insurance. It's happening and impacting every business. But to your point, whether it's identity theft or whether it's another type of fraud committed through technology, we have a big target on our back. Insurance carriers have money, and that's what these fraudsters, these bad actors, are looking for. And I would say that absolutely there's a responsibility of the carriers to make sure that we're addressing that. There's also a responsibility for the individual investigators to understand, make sure they're growing their knowledge so that they can be at the front line, being able to identify and resist that fraud.
One of the things that you guys have talked about a little bit is transnational organized crime. Dennis, do you want to kind of dive into that with a little bit more detail?
Yeah, and I think it plays into everything that we're talking about, the convergence of cyber, the convergence of and cyber and fraud, and this transnational crime that's going on around the globe. But I think first we have to really kind of define and understand what transnational organized crime actually means. And to me, I think basically it just means that criminal activities that are planned, coordinated, executed by organized groups or networks operating across national borders. So these criminal organizations, they engage in a bunch of different illicit activities, not just insurance fraud, but drug trafficking, human smuggling, money laundering, fraud. There's a whole bunch of different types of activity that these transnational organized crime groups go. But as it relates to insurance fraud, I think it refers to fraudulent activities perpetrated by these organized crime with an international reach. And that's really significant because we talked a little bit about vehicle crime, and I think that's a perfect example that we can talk about how they're operating across nationalities with vehicles. Vehicles are, from an insurance company, it's a theft. Our fiduciary responsibility is to, compensate someone if their vehicle is stolen, but that vehicle is being used for every one of those illicit activities that I talked about, the human traffic, drug trafficking, human smuggling or trafficking, the terrorist activity. If you think about the car bombs, they're stolen vehicles, they put a bomb in it and, they target, whatever they're targeting. So I do think that it's very sophisticated. they're growing at a tremendous rate, because their nation states are actually sponsoring them and using them to, do this illicit activity. And the biggest thing is, how do we get money, or how do we make money? And the easiest way for them to make money are staging accidents, stealing vehicles, smuggling vehicles, using chop shops, or whatever the activity that insurance fraud is, the flavor of the day for these guys. And they're also, one other thing too, and then I'll kind of calm down with my thoughts, but you hit a hot point there when you talk about these guys, is that they're actually operating like businesses. So they have a hierarchical infrastructure that they're using, and they're operating on the dark web. And they're even have want ads on the dark web that they pay people. If you're a driver of a staged accident, you're going to get a certain amount. If you're a passenger, you're going to get a certain amount. And they're operating from Eurasia or other parts of the world, and they're facilitating these accidents or stuff in the United States, and the money's being funded back and forth. So it's a big problem that we are grappling with on a global basis, and I think it's something that's going to continue to grow unless we really get a good grip on it.
I was going to say, we operate, not that the United States maybe is 100% moral, ethical with some of the things in our society today, but we tend to look at things through a different lens, as Dennis is saying. And that's why, somebody like Dennis's global background is so important when we have dialogues like this. Because in other parts of the countries, and I've actually seen photos and videos of people going into office towers in other countries, Russia predominantly, but also in China and elsewhere, dressed in Armani silk, Armani suits, silk ties, dressed to the hilt. And they're with organizations that are trying to commit financial crimes in the United States. That is their business function. Yeah. And it's not hidden. This isn't clandestine in some dark hallway somewhere. And what Dennis is talking about when he says these are organized businesses that are out there promoting and recruiting, we have to really kind of take off our US and American lens of how we look at the world and realize that there are some really bad organized actors out there that are vastly different than anything we have seen before because of the technology.
And because of what they can find the money faster too. And I think that's why you see them targeting, insurance carriers like we talked about before. And I was also thinking about the dark web, because there's another piece. And I know I don't want to pull us away from the transnational organized crime, but I just want to add one comment because of what Dennis said about the dark web. There's a lot in there. There's a lot that's offered to people who go into the dark web, teaching them how to do a variety of crimes, including, of course, insurance fraud. And people who are individuals who want to commit insurance fraud, it's just a plethora of information for them to go to gather from that, to learn how to commit all types of insurance fraud. So whether it's stealing a vehicle, or that's stealing someone's identity, creating a synthetic identity, so much more. It's something that is very, very difficult for us to battle. We can, but it requires knowledge, skill, and dedication.
Is there a way to measure this type of fraud? Are we measuring it? I mean, what's kind of the plan for the future here?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I don't think, and I think it was directed towards me. Sorry guys if it's not, but I don't think that we really understand the impact that transnational organized crime has on the insurance industry. We don't have a methodology right now to figure out, okay, this is how we're going to measure what the impact is. So at the Global Summit this year, we have Dr. Kaser from the General Initiative for Transnational Organized Crime. She's written a bunch of different papers on measuring the impact of transnational organized crime for a number of different sectors, but insurance isn't one of them. She has one on vehicle crime. So we're bringing her into the summit, because the summit is a think tank, and we'll talk about that later. But we're bringing her in the summit to figure out if there's a way that we can come up with a methodology for the industry to measure the impact. My theory is that the impact is so significant that it's going to shock a lot of people, just like the study that the coalition did when we learned that the cost of insurance fraud annually is $308 billion. I think once we see what the transnational organized crime is doing in the insurance industry, we're going to be shocked at that. So I do think that it's coming, the measurements are coming, and we're going to work diligently to come up with the proper methodology to do that. So one other thing too that you really have to be aware of for the investigators that are listening to this and anybody else that's listening to this is that these organized crime groups are targeting vulnerable employees. So if you're a company and you cut back your staff, or there's, you're overworking, the company's overworking you, these employees are vulnerable. They're getting paid by these organized crime groups to kind of look for vulnerabilities, for being redundant, but look for vulnerabilities within the system so they can come in and do a ransom attack or ransomware or steal identities or do a breach. There's actually gangs and groups across the globe that are targeting employees in the United States to do that type of activity. So I think we have to be aware of it from an internal and an external perspective with these guys too.
So Dennis, can you expand more, or do you happen to have any samples of some of the most prevalent transnational organized crimes and cross-border activity you are seeing that is impacting the insurance market at this moment right now?
Yeah, so right now I think, it runs the gamut. So it's going to be everything you can think of from a transnational organized crime. But for insurance specific, I think the biggest one we can point to is vehicle crimes. The stolen motor vehicles that are being used for other crimes. An example that I'll give you, earlier this year, Interpol had they had a 2-week operation called Operation Carback, where they set up in 77 ports to identify suspicious activity. They have a database of, I think, 7.2 billion records. I think that's what it was. It was 7.2 million records of stolen motor vehicles. But during that 2-week period, they identified 1,100 stolen motor vehicles, 64 motorcycles. They detained 222 suspects within these that are suspected of stolen motor vehicle traffickers. They detained 8 suspected people smugglers, 26 fraudulent vehicle documents, which are cloned vehicles or fraudulent titles. And just to show the cross-industry aspect of it, they also seized about 480,000 cartons of stolen cigarettes. So I think it's really a big thing, and Interpol's probably doing the best when they do that. So they also, at the same time they were doing that, they raided a bunch of chop shops, and they found a lot of information that triggered further investigations into organized crime groups globally that are related to vehicle crime. But during that process, and this is all public, so I'm not giving any information that I shouldn't be given. They seized a lot of valuable and crucial information that gave them insight into what other transnational organized crimes are doing with the stolen motor vehicles for drug trafficking, migrant smuggling, all those other things. So I think that's probably the best one, Jesse, to kind of highlight, and I think you'll see more and more of these, especially with Interpol's database and the opportunities that they're working with 135 countries to identify this type of activity. We'll start seeing more and more of that.
Thank you. Matthew, I'd like to ask you, what important challenges or opportunities do you see for the industry's fight against fraud?
Well, thank you. And I think it all begins with understanding, and why a podcast like this is so important for industry leaders in our country and for other countries around the world to really appreciate the vastness of this problem of global insurance fraud. Because the one bet I am willing to make, and I am not a gambler, I won't even put a penny in a slot machine in Vegas, but I will take this bet that today we are only seeing the tiniest sliver of the tip of the iceberg of global insurance fraud that's out there. We talked about the QBot. That's $58 million. That's a ton of money. But 2 weeks ago, if any people read about the Vest2 fraud, Vest2 was an organization based out of Israel doing reinsurance financing. And this has turned into about a $12 billion minimum fraud of fake reinsurance financing. And the coalition, we heard about this, we promoted it. We talked about it at the NAIC Anti-Fraud Task Force meeting in Seattle in August. And that led to Commissioner Navarro, the head of the Anti-Fraud Task Force, and the elected insurance commissioner in Delaware, coming back to his state, launching an investigation. And now they are deeply involved. I think they've tracked at least 3 or 4 of these Vesttoo frauds into the state of Delaware. And that's just one example. When I say the tip of the iceberg, we're only talking here about 14 days of news coverage. So what about all of those claims that are those individuals or are those organized office tower people in Moscow or Beijing or Shanghai or elsewhere that are targeting all of this that we haven't heard about, that we don't know about, and that are getting away with the frauds and the scams? So your question is vitally important. So A, we have to be aware of it, understand that it is an issue, and accept it as the new reality of insurance fraud. The second thing that goes with that in terms of understanding, and trust me, this was eye-opening to me as a guy growing up in Dayton, Ohio, and through the coalition and SIU and other programs to be able to travel around the world now and talk with other anti-fraud leaders, like at the Global Insurance Fraud Summit. But when you stand there on a world stage and you explain to other countries' anti-fraud leaders the unique state-based regulation system, which is wonderful for the US, but that we have here, and you try to tell them we have 51 different commissioners, directors, or superintendents of insurance. We have 51 different sets of laws on insurance and insurance fraud. And we have 51 different sets of regulations dealing with insurance and insurance fraud. Their mouths drop open and they say, "You've got to be kidding me." We say, "No, but it works here." But the problem with that, I want the SIU members who are watching this podcast to think about this. Let's imagine, Jesse, that you had a fraud investigation in Texas, but you had no clue who to contact in Arizona for a cross-border fraud. No clue who to talk to. But you knew the fraud was taking place in both Texas and Arizona. Now, we think that's absurd because we know who your counterparts are and you can communicate with various states, and we even have immunity. Well, keep in mind, part of the reason for the Global Insurance Fraud Summit is to open up those same lines of communication and knowing and trusting each other that for years we've enjoyed in the United States. Because if you have an insurance fraud investigation taking place in Turkey, in Korea, in Saudi Arabia, and it has a tie to Texas, how do you know, or how would you even start to guess and find out who to contact? That's the beauty of the Global Insurance Fraud Summit and opening up these lines of communication, is so the rest of the world understands this kind of fractured but workable system that we have in the US. But how many of our viewers here today could say who's in charge of insurance fraud investigation in France or in the Netherlands or in Saudi Arabia? Well, by groups like SIU, the Coalition, NICB, all participating in the Global Summit, we can say, here's your contact. And we can say to those countries, here's your contact in the United States. So it's really opening up so that people trust each other, know what to do, because if we don't, then we're just letting the fraudsters run the gauntlet over us because we don't even know who the people are to contact. We have no way of communicating and gathering those individuals together on an annualized basis to increase those ties and to increase the knowledge and the sharing of information. So that's why it's so vitally important. And I think Dennis will talk a little more about the Global Summit, but that's really plays a very important role. And then the other piece we have to marry into this is technology. And how do we use these great technology platforms that we have, the data-driven ability that we all know is key to fighting insurance fraud, but to make sure that we have those systems, those programs, and those technologies in place to address insurance fraud on that global platform that we're talking about. And, the coalition also does our state of insurance fraud technology study that we roll out every 2 years. And when we did that study 2 years ago, for the first time in the decade plus that we've done that study, insurance fraud professionals and insurance companies in the United States told us in the next 2 years, they expected their technology spend to go down. It had always gone up. And in the 2-year period before, it had gone up even substantially. But it was a rather dramatic drop. And so much so that we went back and we asked, and we got some good responses because insurers said, well, we've already made that investment. We told you 2 years ago we were going to do it. We did it. Now we want to see, does it work? What's the return on it? And figured out the system. Others told us that they were waiting. They were waiting on things like new regulations before they were willing to make those investments to make sure that their technology kept up with new laws and regulations. All understandable. But we also have to understand that all we can do, open up those lines of communications, is great, but we still need the data systems and the technology systems that are out there to tackle global fraud nationally and globally. Because companies like Protiviti, the other great associate members of the coalition that are out there doing these services, they're not going to do it if there's not a market for it. So there has to be a willingness of the insurance industry to realize the importance of it and then provide a market where those new technologies on the global scale can be developed and brought to the marketplace.
Thank you, Matthew. So with that, Celeste, what can carriers and fraud fighters do today to help defend their companies and customers against insurance fraud?
Well, it's interesting. I was listening to what Matthew was saying, and I was thinking he was spot on. As you think about what was really critical to insurance investigators, SIU investigators years ago, was, do I know somebody from one state to the next? So do I have that person that I can call? And they relied on SIU, for example, organizations such as SIU to know who to contact. And now that's not enough, because we've talked about this over the past several minutes about how the fraud is being, that we're experiencing, whatever country you're in, is potentially being perpetrated from countries far away across the ocean. So how do you know who that individual, who to contact in those countries that, like Matthew referenced? So it's really important for carriers to be part of the industry organizations, to embrace those organizations that enable, that not only do they educate their members, but also they connect their members. They help them network so they know who to call if it's in Saudi Arabia, if it's in Brazil, or in Sweden or China, or whoever that they need to reach out to, that they know they have a contact to get them started as they're trying to figure out, I've got what I think is potential fraud, but I don't know, how do I connect with someone in another country? So it's just so important. And that is important in a national and international level. We have got to stay engaged if we're not connecting, because we've talked about the dark web and how these criminals are connecting. If we're not doing that, how are we going to fight it? Because we're not going to be successful as an individual carrier. We're only going to be successful if we're connecting and fighting that fraud together. So being part of organizations such as SIU, the coalition, are so critical, NICB, and supporting that collaboration that's occurring globally. I think it's important also, we've talked about how advanced the technology that these criminals are utilizing. It's important that insurance carriers invest in detection models and utilize technology, make sure that they're advancing their technology. We've talked at the very beginning how technology is just changing, evolving so quickly. Carriers have to do the same. The fraud that we're investigating 10 years ago is still there, but it's changed so rapidly, what we're seeing on a day-to-day basis. So we've got to make sure that our technology supports that investigation, utilizing, firms, whether it, vendors such as Protiviti and so many more that are out there to help the carriers so that they have the technology they need to be able to detect it and investigate it. Staying current, we've talked about some cases. Dennis talked about some of the things going on in Interpol, and Matthew's talked about some of the other things that are happening across the globe. We've got to stay alert. We have to stay informed. You don't just read your county newspaper anymore. You've got to stay informed of what's going on across the globe, because what's happening across the globe is really your county newspaper now, because what's happening there is going to be happening in your town or in your country.
Hey,
So that
Celeste,
is so important.
what's a
Yes.
newspaper? What's a newspaper?
I know, right? Right? Nobody has a newspaper anymore.
Right.
But for those that are relying on local news, that's not enough.
No.
Not even national news is no longer enough. If you're not looking for those articles to understand what are the trends that are occurring in other countries, you'll never be prepared for what hits you. So that is so important. Education, increasing your knowledge, is so critical. You've got to have the right skill set, the right tool. So the skill set of the investigators, of the analysts, of your underwriters, your claims handlers, the tools and the technology to help them identify that fraud and mitigate the damages is so important. So it's important at an individual level for those that are the front line, those analysts, those underwriters, those claim reps, and those investigators. And it's important from the decision makers of those carriers to dedicate the resources in order to resist this fraud. Because if we're not doing that, it's just going to grow. And it's get to a point where our policyholders are going to say, I don't want to pay for all this, because it all falls on the policyholder.
And Celeste, you know, at the coalition, we talk about, and I know that IASU supports it as well. It is having those resources, having that data, and it's keeping it all in the right balance. It's the human factor and the data, using it effectively to fight this new world of insurance fraud that we're in. And the other thing that I think is also important here, and you know, the coalition has a unique role of working in the US with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners as an advisor to the Anti-Fraud Task Force, but also as one of the consumer representatives to the nation's insurance commissioners. And I do think in this era, if we're going to truly be committed to fighting insurance fraud, it's going to take a stronger partnership between American insurers and American regulators. And that's not always easy to do. But we are going to have to be willing to share that information of what we're learning about global fraud, what we're seeing, what those systems are showing, and the types of frauds that we're experiencing, and be willing to share that information, report it thoroughly, not just one line, check the box compliance reporting, but really partner with our nation's regulators if we want to have an opportunity to get ahead of the curve on global fraud. Because no matter what carrier you work for, a single carrier cannot tackle the world. But the professions, our organizations working together, bringing in the regulatory side, bringing in the law enforcement side, all of us communicating, all of us cooperating, all of us working together in the anti-fraud fight, that's how we're going to succeed.
Yes.
So Dennis, we've heard the phrase Global Insurance Fraud Summit a bunch of times today. What is the Global Insurance Fraud Summit? When is it? Where is it? Some history on it. Can you just give us a little bit of details on it?
That's music to my ears that we've said it so much. You know, this is the 5th year coming up in October that we've held the summit. So this year's summit's going to be October 15th through the 18th in Edinburgh, Scotland, which is really good. It's really a great place to have a summit because it's central and a lot of different countries attend it. So over the years, we've had more than, I think, 35, 40 different countries that have participated in this. So the vision, I guess, let me start with the vision of what it was when we created this. It was to create global collaboration. I'll read it. So to create global collaboration to fight insurance fraud by convening industry organizations, consortiums, country level consortiums, insurance fraud crime bureaus, regulators, thought leaders, and industry organizations from around the globe into one location to really formalize the global fight against insurance fraud. So the problem went 5 years ago that a group of us came up and we said, okay, there's a big problem here. We're seeing these fraudsters hiding behind borders. We're seeing companies that operate in multiple countries that can't even share information because they don't have the right information, and there's a lot of regulatory issues that were preventing them from doing proper investigations. So we wanted to bring this group of people together to kind of formalize the fight and figure out a way how we can, as a globe, eliminate the borders and really fight fraud and bring the fight to these guys, because we can't be reactive like we have been in the past. We need to really be more proactive and put the fraudsters on notice that the insurance industry is not going to tolerate people stealing money from them. So we got together. Obviously, the first people I called were the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud, IASU, the National Insurance Crime Bureau, and a few others. And they were all on board. And we convened in Barcelona, Spain, for 2 days. There was 16 countries at that time that attended, about 40 people, and we really started to formalize this fight. And John Franchini, Matthew, you'll remember that he was from the National Association of Insurance Commissioner. He was presented there, and he said, it's great that you're doing this, but how are you going to do this if you don't have a global definition of insurance fraud? How are you going to, how can you bring the fight if you don't define that? So with the coalition and the Global Insurance Fraud Summit and a bunch of other organizations, including IASU, we were able to come up with that, and hopefully we'll roll that out this year on what that definition is. So we have a bunch of different people that do it. So it's made up of no one really owns the Global Insurance Fraud Summit. It's just a think tank or a group of people that get together every year and really formalize this. And I'll talk about some of the different things that we can do. But you can't talk about it without talking about the people that are sponsoring this, because there's no charge to go to this. And there is a lot of cost. If you think about the food, the venue, the AV, all these other things that go along with it. So we ask, for a limited amount of sponsors, because we don't want it to be a feeding frenzy of people that are trying to sell things to this group. We really want to make it a working summit. So we have organizations that are sponsoring this. I ask you, great sponsor, couldn't do this without them. Their international footprint with the European chapter and the United States chapter has really been a huge value to us. Matthew Smith and the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud couldn't do this without them. The National Insurance Crime Bureau, we have Verisk is sponsoring this and are part of this now. We have PwC, Scope Now, Quantexa, Protivity. The list goes on and on and on of people that really are getting involved and are really focused on doing this. So what do we do at the summit? I think that's probably the best thing to kind of talk about. The summit meets, we have country updates. So we have a bunch of different countries that come in, they give us an update. So Turkey comes in and tells us, here's some of the challenges, trends, best practices that we have. Poland has spoken about, here's the technology that we're using and how we're using it effectively to fight fraud. The IFB in the UK talk about how they work with the industry in the London Police Department. We have the FBI, the IRS, the United Nations, a number of different organizations and regulators from Insurance Europe, the American Association, the Association of British Insurers, the Insurance Sweden. We have some French regulators, the UK cabinet. All these people come together. We limit it to 100 people. It's a invite-only think tank. And what we're doing, so we came up with a few different committees that we're doing. Number one, we wanted to create this global vehicle crime task force that we talked about because of the crime of transnational organized crime. We wanted to create the global definition of insurance fraud. We're building that global fraud directory. So like Matthew was saying, if you're in the United States and you need somebody in Tunisia, who are you going to call? What are some of the regulations that are having there? What are some of the insurance laws? Who are the key contacts that we want to reach out to and see if there's the same fraud trends happening there? Or I have someone from that country here that I think may be involved in fraud, whatever the case may be. So building that fraud directory or fraud plan is really going to be helpful. We're exploring an international fraud intelligence center. John, it's crazy because the interest that we're having in this, if you think about it, in Saudi Arabia, if you have an increase of imports that are coming in, illegal imports, and you have an increase of exports from South Africa, maybe, and then in the United Kingdom, there's an increase in vehicle thefts. Maybe they're all related. Maybe it's one group or transnational organized crime. So if we build this global intelligence center and we can bring in data and information, public and private data together, fuse it together, and then provide intelligence across the globe, it's really a value add to the insurance industry, and it'll give these fraudsters a little bit fewer places to hide than they are right now. And then we're doing research on transnational organized crime and the convergence of cyber crimes like that. So it's an amazing opportunity, that I just can't thank the people like Matthew and Celeste for their, undying support in making this happen. And I think it's going to grow over the next few years for that.
Dennis, do you have law enforcement from those European nations themselves attend as well?
Yeah, we sure do. So we've had Portugal Police, we've had London Police Department, the Scottish Police Department are going to attend this year because it's in Scotland. We've had a number of different, whatever country we're in, we want the local law enforcement and fraud bureau or crime bureau there as well to be a keynote speaker. Yeah.
And I think pick up on what Dennis was talking about, one of the great examples of working globally in partnership. The Global Summit this year will be in Edinburgh, Scotland in October, but the 2024 Global Summit is scheduled to be in Rome, Italy in June of 2024 and run back to back in the same week with IASU Europe conference that will also be in Rome. So there's a great example of how we can pair together. So bringing together the IASU Europe conference at the start of that week in June in Italy, and then concluding that same week with the Global Summit at the same hotel, overlap of some, hopefully some meals and social events to just create that global cooperation environment that we've been talking about in today's podcast.
Yeah, I think some of the
I'll just speak at I was just saying, of course, one of the benefits for IASU, there's many benefits, but it also enables us to make sure that these countries understand the value of IASU, and is there an opportunity and a need for more local chapters to support that networking, that collaboration. So there is a benefit beyond what we've discussed as well.
Yeah, and Korea is a perfect example, right, Celeste? I mean, they're coming to this summit. At ISU they have a chapter there, but it's not as active as we want it to be. So it's a great opportunity to bring them together and kind of help them and understand, are they struggling? How can we help them? Or maybe they want to host a summit, and promote ISU, and that's just one region. You can think about all the different other regions that, would benefit from having IASU, there as a chapter. So I do think that there are some opportunities though. So if people are listening, to this and they want to get involved with this, reach out to whatever organization you belong to or reach out to me and I'll be happy to talk to you more about this. That, I think we can't do this in a vacuum. We need everybody's help and we need everybody to really buy into this and move forward with this, formalizing this fight and taking the fight to these guys and bringing it to them and letting them know that we're not just going to lay down and take it.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. A lot of interesting stuff. And if you're watching this, again, reach out to Dennis and Matthew, Celeste. They could kind of point you in the right direction. That was actually going to be my last question I was going to ask because it was invite only. How do you get an invite if you're, if you want to be part of it? Is there a website for it as well? Is there more information online that they can find?
Yeah, globalinsuranceFraud.org. There's a website that's still work in progress, so it's limited information on there, but you can go there and you can find information about what we're doing. It's going to be up a lot more information will be uploaded this year because it's the first year that we've actually got it going, John. So yeah, but reach out to me, especially if you want to help actually fund this or support this or have your logo as part of this. It's a good opportunity to really bring it. And I think the conference in June of next year is going to be phenomenal. I mean, it's a perfect location for, to bring ISU and the Global Insurance Fraud Summit together.
Well, does anybody have anything else they'd want to add that maybe we've left out? You only have 4 more months, Matthew, so whatever you want to say, you better say it now.
No, I just really hope that people do have a better understanding of the globalization of insurance fraud. And I again want to salute IASU for really putting this at the forefront as only your second podcast. And congratulations on the SIU Today podcast. We support you fully. And thank you for giving us the opportunity today to talk about this important issue.
And I do want to add that I do want to personally thank both Matthew and Dennis for joining me today to talk about this such a critical topic and so relevant to our viewers today. So really, really appreciate the partnership and the impact that we've been able to make together. And I look forward to that in the future.
Well, everybody, I think that's going to wrap it up for today. So thanks for joining us on the podcast, and look forward to seeing you next time. We'll see you at the Global Insurance Fraud Summit. We'll see you at IAGIO, and we'll see you at the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud in a couple months.
Yes, thank you all.
Thanks.